Okay, recording and transcription have started. This means because we're going to put this video online afterwards, if you agree, should you not want to be filmed or not have your voice posted online afterwards, I would ask you please to keep your camera and mic off. If it's on, then I'll take this to be your agreement that you're happy to be filmed. So I'm going to say a few more words about why John Ratey is our guest tonight. First of all, I would like to introduce this seminar series, which is organized by the Collège International de Philosophie in collaboration with King's College, organized by myself and my colleagues Marc Côté and Patrick French. Patrick was also present tonight. I'm extremely happy that you could make time, and I want to thank you both, and Marc also in his absence, for your support, which has made this seminar possible. Not only possible, but also multidimensional, because it's really extraordinary how we've had voices coming from many different disciplines. Now, this is a monthly open access seminar that has also been organized with the help of the Foundation Ibsen for research into rare diseases, who are one of the main benefactors of the Collège International de Philosophie. So I want to thank them too. And I also want to thank everyone who's been working behind the scenes to help make this possible. Now, the title of this seminar series is The Mental State of Noise and the New Frontiers of Cognition. Rationality has historically been modeled on the power of calculation, ratio as in the Latin reor, or to count or calculate. Artificial intelligence, in turn, is commonly mapped onto a received idea of human intelligence, suggesting a perfect but unequal fit between human and artificial intelligence. However, this narrow vision of intelligence conflates both with the power of calculation and logical deduction. As a result, speed, volume, and variety of forms of information processing have served as a measuring rod to the extent that one thing is easily forgotten. The concepts of intelligence and of information remain fuzzy. This openness affords a degree of freedom, but it also facilitates the arbitrary imposition of a reductive conception of intelligence. But what if we turn the question around? Rather than focus on the quantifiable performance of both human and artificial intelligence, this seminar seeks to ask what qualitative aspects of intelligence can be foregrounded if we look at the specific ways and the different ways in which humans and machines malfunction or capitulate when they are confronted with noise. Instead of comparing human and artificial processing power, we may thus ask more specifically about intelligence's resourcefulness in the face of noise. How then does our thinking about learning change if we take into consideration the way humans and machines both mobilize the generative potentials of noise? In this context, we will start with a working concept of noise that refers broadly to a source of uncertainty, unaccounted for variation, or perturbation, but with a particular interest in the concept of the mental state of noise as developed by Stephen Sands and John Ratey in their article, A Concept of Noise, which was published in the journal Psychiatry in 1986, and which has been, as some of you may know already, absolutely crucial to my reflections on noise. So this seminar calls on thinkers from all disciplines, from philosophy to mental health and engineering sciences, to tackle the outstanding conceptualization of noise specific to the context of cognition. The objective is to foreground aspects of intelligence that are neglected in the traditional focus on the quantifiable power of information processing. And to this end, we may adopt the famous remark by the physiologist and surgeon René Leriche, who said that health is life lived in the silence of the organs. Now, if pathology reveals the hitherto silent functions of our organs, we may ask by analogy what the breakdown of intelligence reveals about its silent functions and that of its organs, be they human or technical, individual or collective entities. So with this, I thank you all very much for joining. I'd ask you to turn your cameras and mics off for the duration of the talk. And then after John gave his talk, I'm going to respond very briefly and open up to the discussion. And I would like to remind you all that this is a seminar series where nothing is taken for granted, and as a result, there are no wrong questions or there are no questions that can't be asked. You are all from different disciplines. Nobody is expected to be an expert in somebody else's discipline. So please do introduce yourselves as a human being rather than an abstract voice in the conversation. If you can put your camera on, it makes it an awful lot more welcoming and warm in the discussion. We do want to know who you are, if you like, what your angle on noise is, what your own work and research contributions are to the field, or what questions you bring to it. So please remember, this is a seminar, and the objective is a convivial discussion that hopefully leads to further networks and connections that wouldn't have been made otherwise. So with this, I'm going to once more thank John, and also perhaps say that when I wrote my book on the epistemology of noise, your article has been absolutely central. It was a turning point in my research, and at the time of writing, there was a moment when I thought, maybe he will read it one day. So I kind of self-censored myself a little bit and thought I was a bit worried, but I really honestly didn't really hope that we would meet. And it's just such a pleasure and an honor to have this opportunity to meet. Thank you so much for joining and for agreeing to participate in this seminar, John.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here and honored that you took an interest in my the paper and wrote a book about it. So I'm very much honored and delighted to be here. My story begins that really when being a philosophy major, and going through medical school, etc. And I began my residency in psychiatry at a time when the DSM-3, or Diagnostic Statistic Manual 3, was adopted, and the nosology of mental problems was attempted to be categorized. Psychiatry was going heavy science. In my training, at my institution, we were very much different. We were not concerned with numbers of symptoms to make a diagnosis, but we were charged with trying to empathically understand our patient's inner state. Many of my patients were severely ill, psychiatrically and neurologically, and they had often had problems with violence and self-abusive behavior. For this reason, they were chronically hospitalized. There was a similarity amongst them all that crossed many diagnoses and guided Stephen Sands and myself to write our paper, The Concept of Noise. Noise transcended the attempt to isolate and categorize psychiatric disorders. This was a state marked by these patients' inability to deal with the normal and the ordinary. In fact, many encounters with the world contributed to their state of inner confusion and even terror. The inner felt experience was a booming, buzzing, crowding of stimuli, not adequately processed, which often added to their chaos. Stimuli, thoughts, feelings were, as my daughter would say, a hot mess, and not much time or space to tolerate, to understand, or even be known by them. Thus, they resulted in developing what I later called the ahistorical self. They have a fractured memory of the past, recent and distant, not knowing what they did or even what they like or hate. Noise disrupted any attempt to form a coherent sense of who they were. Normally, we have the capability of imposing a threshold of attention. We bring our attention to bear in order to ensure stable structures of representation, of memory, and of a consequence of a sense of self. They did not have this. The noisy state creates its own pressure for relief, which leads to behaviors designated to relieve, control, or avoid internal disorder. In this hyper-aroused state, this noise could result in a catastrophic reaction, an explosive, panic-driven reaction that often led to their violence or extreme self-abusive behavior. These behaviors are apt to contribute to the confusion they are meant to relieve, disrupting especially the ability to recognize how they felt and to communicate about felt experience in relation to others. They often were in a state of hyperarousal, similar to Phyllis Greenacre's pre-anxiety tensions. The noise had them at the ready to react impulsively and further their chaos. They lived in a background of uncertainty, unsure of what they heard, what they did, or what actually they heard, what they did, or what actually. I'm getting feedback. Okay. I'm getting feedback. Okay. As well, they often had an internal pressure to name what they were experiencing, or what Festinger called an evaluative need, to bring some measure of control over the chaos. This is the stuff of voices, delusions, strongly held bizarre beliefs that are an attempt to order their disorder. Noise leads to inner disorganization of everything from cognition to consciousness. Thus, noise becomes an object or a mental event itself. And at the same time, it affects the cognitive processes, disrupting the attention and all the so-called executive functions that attention guides. Using what Selye showed us, what stress is to the body, noise is to the brain. Cecile had a terrific quote from Lyric, health is the silence of the organs. And we imply that silence in the noise allows for mental health, as it allows our cognitive apparatus and emotional awareness to function unimpeded. Without our executive functions working, we are primitive at best. We saw this noise as a state to treat and hit upon using the beta blockers, propranolol and other drugs used for blood pressure and heart problems at the time. We hit upon that it helped stop the violence, impulsive acts and calm the patient without obtunding them, without making them less aware. One patient who started me on this journey was a young man, middle-aged now, who had a severe head injury and had been confined him to a wheelchair for many years. He had a pronounced tremor where his arms would move automatically. And so he was treated with very high doses of the beta blockers, which helped the tremor and happily also stopped his violent outbursts. He would occasionally leap out of his chair as much as he could and try to strangle one of the staff. This unfortunate man was discharged to a nursing home as his symptoms receded, both the tremor and his violent acts. But when he went to the nursing home, they saw the higher than normal doses of the medication and reduced them, resulting in return of his tremors and again of the violence. When he came back, we reinstituted the higher dose, his tremor went away, and his violence was stilled. I was struck with this calming of the body, which had a remarkable effect on turning down his internal noise. The beta blockers work in part by reducing the resting tension of our large skeletal muscles, thus helping to dampen the hyperaroused state. The model for the effectiveness of these so-called cardiac drugs is that they interrupt the reverberating circuit of emotional agitation, cognitive disarray, and peripheral arousal, which can culminate in an intensification of noise and the tendency to act impulsively. I found that calming the bodily noise or tension, this had an effect of turning down the inner pressure caused by the distress of the moment. The beta blockers actually improve the cognitive processes in users, boosting both attention and memory. I spent the next 10 years researching this new tool and ended up focusing on using a beta blocker that acted mainly in the periphery, that is, mainly in the body. It didn't cross easily the blood-brain barrier. This had much the same result as the beta blockers that work both in the brain and in our body. Both reduce the noise. My orientation has evolved to a much more neuroscience basis, and with that, a broader, more inclusive look at noise. I soon saw this noisy state in less severe patients, and of all of us, where the intensity of the crowding experience leads to emotional distress and can have a tremendous impact on our ability to cognate, to learn, to pay attention, and to remember. All of us are prone to the distress of noise. Think of performance anxiety, where the anxiety and panic disrupt our ability to think and speak. Beta blockers are still often prescribed for people with performance anxiety because it doesn't disrupt their thinking or memory or their ability to speak. I began studying and treating people with ADHD, another group who complain of a noisy inner state. They would complain of the static in their brains, saying that they are not fully dialed in to the external and internal world. It was like on the old radio dials that we used to try to get to the right, the exact moment to get it fully dialed in. They were a bit off, and they had the static and they could hear themselves a bit, but it was not as easy as it should be. I spent the next part of my life studying and writing about ADHD with my partner, Edward Hallowell. We just published our fourth book in the Driven to Distraction series, ADHD 2.0, where we highlight the changes in our understanding and treatment option for this very common noisy state. An example of the description in some of our ADHD's patients, one woman said, "I have these troubling, jagged thoughts, images, ideas, and feelings that pop up unimpeded in my mind like rocks in a river as I desperately try to steady another trip down the relentlessly moving rapids within. Their attempt to do simple tasks, follow directions, remember what they had just heard, take a Herculean effort to keep steady amidst the internal state of change. We are fond of saying that the ADHD brain is like a Ferrari engine with bicycle brakes. They cannot stop due to the internal pressure to move forward, to finish the task, and in this way they may help still the noise. They sometimes live amid chaos and a noisy exterior. Jim's room looked like a bag lady shopping cart that had been dumped into it. Books, papers, odd socks, half packs of cigarettes, and other loose ends lay scattered about, much like the bits and pieces of cognition that were strewn about in his mind. ADHDers create noise quite a bit as well, with odd movements, ceaseless fidgets, and stumbles. Our books chart many of the patients who attest to the noise that is ever present. Today, we can see ADHD through the exciting new science of the fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. It's like a live moving X-ray, and as close as we can get to watching thought in motion. Or as one neuroradiologist said, you can see the brain clicking. With this, we see the brain organized differently. Not so much as a place for this, a place for that, but we can actually witness the brain as organized in networks. In a brain network, we see different parts of the brain all working together. Not as phrenology would have us, but as connectomes. That is, different parts of the brain always working in the same group. When you engage in any task of any kind, from writing an email to digging a hole, various clumps of neurons together is called a connectome that light up in your brain on the fMRI. The connectome that lights up when you're engaged in a task is called the task positive network, or the TPN. This is when your attention is switched on and your executive functions are hopefully working for you. Aptly named, the TPN gets you down to work. You're deliberately doing something and you are intent on doing it, unaware of much beyond the bounds of what you're doing. When you allow your mind to wander from the task, or when you finish the task, or if you pause too long while doing the task, the TPN in your brain defaults to a different connectome. Not surprisingly, given that we default to this state, this other connectome is called the default mode network. The default mode network allows for expansive, imaginative, and creative thinking. The back half of the default mode connectome is called the positive cingulate, posterior cingulate. It facilitates your autobiographical memory, stuff that has happened to you and you have stored away, your personal history. This allows you to think back, draw upon, and pick apart the past. The front part of this default mode is in the medial prefrontal cortex, and it works just the opposite, but they work together usually. It enables you to look forward and to think about, to imagine, and plan for the future. It is in default mode that you daydream, and you can miss your last exit on the highway, or make interesting connections between disparate concepts. It's what we see when we ask every patient is put into the fMRI and told to think of nothing, just let your mind wander. This helps get a baseline for everyone put into the fMRI looking at their brain. This signature is always present in all of us, and this led to the paradigm shift in brain science. I think of the default mode network as our internal self-system, says John Gabriele, a neuroscience and professor at MIT, who has been studying various disorders from schizophrenia, autism, ADHD for his whole career using the fMRI. He goes on. It's the default mode is a bit of a chatterbox. Some chatter is good, some is destructive. To paraphrase Gabriele, the problem with ADD is twofold. The first is what's called the anti-correlation property of the two networks, the TPN and the DMN. That when you're in the TPN, normally, the DMN shuts up or is de-emphasized. You don't want to be daydreaming. You want all your energy and your attention to be on what you're doing. But in the ADHD brain, the fMRI shows that when the TPN is turned on, the DMN still is active. It acts as trying to muscle its way into what you're paying attention to, thereby distracting you. I liken it to a magnet that pulls you away from that which you're attending to pull you into this default mode. Adding another important spin, Gabriele says within the DMN itself, the front and the back part aren't always stable for ADD people. So you have two defaults, if you will, two defects in their functioning of these two very important networks. Typically, people have synchrony between the two parts of the default mode. They go up and down together. Not so in ADD. They are off kilter, out of sync. All this leads to noise. Along with these two key networks, the salience networks, which guides the TPN and in health shuts down the DMN, allows for focusing. This is similar to the pertinence filter of Norman, who we mentioned in our original paper, is helping to limit the information coming in. As we wrote, phenomenologically, it is as if patients vulnerable to the chaos and overloading that we are calling noise are always wide open. Anything seems to satisfy their pertinence filter, and they are thus prone to flooding. This being wide open when we are not choosing what to attend to adds to the noisy DMN, the default mode network. So metaphorically and neurogeographically, the default mode may be the center of the brain's noise. It gets out of control and has troubles in many, if not all, of our brain-based disorders. Here is where stimulant medication can be very useful and have miraculous changes, much like the beta blockers did, because both of them can help manage the impulsivity and inner chaos. The effects of the stimulant on noise and attention are well known, and the reports of our patients are sometimes magical. One said that after being treated, he said that 20 monkeys on typewriters that live in my brain seem to go on a lunch break when I take my medicine. Another said he did not in fact know that everyone did not live with the background buzz in their head. With the medicine, the buzz diminished, went away, and he was able to think more clearly. What we found that as the thinking became quieter and attention more comfortable and controllable, memory was easier. This had a sparkling effect on many of our patients' consciousness. Francis Crick opined that consciousness is a factor of attention times short-term memory, and done in a quiet field is what we are all after. So to have enough attention, to have short-term memory working, this is what we need to be conscious, according to Crick. We see remarkable changes brought about when the noise is quieted. People operate freely, and there is usually a period of rapid personal growth. Now, with a clearer head and less distractions, the pent-up energy is put to good use. In general, tightening the noise reduces the anxiety and vice versa. And this was something that people weren't understanding, that using a stimulant, which can cause anxiety on its own, in these patients actually not only improves the focus, but quiets the anxiety and stress and the noise. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. If we if we were not attentive in the days of the hunter-gatherers, we had better be anxious. We had better be worried. So, because the threat of being cat food was paramount. So treating the internal noise and boosting the intentions results in having a new sense of self that emerges. Memory improves, hyperactivity recedes, temper tantrums abate, and focus persists. To complement clinical findings is that the stimulants help right the ship among the networks involved. The DNM and TPN act similar on medicine to the neurotypical brain. Salience network is improved and there is less inner chaos. Also evolved are the interventions that help quiet the noise. Medications and the holding environments are still very useful, as in our initial paper, but added to them has been exercise and meditation. This is particularly true in ADHD. From the outset of our investigation, we were struck with how ADHD was greatly helped by exercise and meditation. In all of our books, we speak about the benefits of exercise to help still the brain, to help quiet the noise. My book, Spark, The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise in the Brain, contains much of the research that document these health-promoting effects. By quieting the noise, we see remarkable changes in mood and cognition. Schools and businesses across the world have been adopting the new scientific support to make students better learners, workers better workers, with less noise distracting them. We see impulsive behavior and higher test scores in all ages, and having a particularly wonderful effect on aging when exercise becomes part of a person's steady diet, as it improves focus and mood, as well as sharpening our senses to lead better lives. We also find that being physically fit improves our default mode TPN salience network triad. We again move from this off-kilter situation to being more normalized when we look at the fMRI. Both a single bout and chronic exercise bring about the right kind of connectivity with the DMN being quieter. It is not just with aerobic exercise that is helpful, but as we mentioned in our book, balance training. Improving your physical balance and coordination has a rather profound effect on our cognitive functioning. One can imagine that people that are compromised balance-wise have difficulty keeping things right, both physically and neurologically, so that their noise it persists. We had one patient who was, her thoughts were severely disjointed, leading to more noise. Training her balance and coordination made her experience of life more seamless, less noisy. Many of our patients talked about there didn't seem to be coordination of their thinking internally, and this led more to their noisy state. As well, we see changes in ADHD patients with meditation. Again, no surprise, as meditators have a quiet brain. So people with ADD who begin to do yoga or other forms of meditation or the martial arts, which is very meditative at its best. It involves maintaining attention on your immediate experience, putting you in the present and away from the distractions and referential thinking. Yoga, quiet sitting, is often used to improve the focus and reduce the internal noise, and this, of course, shows up on our fMRI as, again, righting the ship between the task performance network and the default mode network. Some of the most amazing meditators who have achieved nirvana, moksha, or satori have absent or very quiet default mode networks and report almost no distractions. In closing, I want to just remind us all we live in a very noisy world, and it is getting noisier by the minute. And this has a profound effect on us. When we were first considering our patient's noisy state, we did not live in a digital world full of distractions, games, news of the second that surrounds us today. We are very aware of the outside, in effect, that living amidst the noise, we become more disorganized and have less of a chance to focus and make the world our own. A paper just out of Denmark showed that looking at almost 2 million Danes over a 6-year period, with 100,000 of them having some form of dementia, they correlated this with the amount of transportation noise that they were living with. So it's associated with a higher risk of dementia. Also, about 2/3 of the people with ADHD have a life expectancy reduced by up to 21 years. Huge reduction in their lifespan. So we know the risks here. And of course, now with our disinformation battles for the minds and souls of the populace, we are beset with truthisms that end up driving whole countries in ways never before imagined. Nowhere is this more important these days in the misinformation campaigns of various groups to cloud the issues and drive home political points by claiming ambiguity and offering one-word banners that settles the pain of uncertainty, a la Festinger, and becomes a vanguard leading a cause. This is especially true today. It is used to directly contradict the supposed settled wisdom of science. So with that, I will close and again, thank Cecile for inviting me and being with you, and I look forward to your questions and also to the weeks ahead as more people are addressing this from different orientations. So thank you. Delighted to be with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. I'm really thrilled and delighted that you brought together both the neuroscientific aspect and one thing that was very important to me was that the patient is at the center of, rather than the kind of statistical categorization of mental illnesses that against which you worked by starting from the patients and the way that they experience this inner state of noise and try to get over it or organize themselves in light of this noise or in the midst of this noise. One question that came to my mind was the relationship between the extremely tight correlation between mind and body. And in particular, the idea that balance and exercise or even medication that calms the body would have immediately an effect on behaviors like, violent behavior, boisterous behavior, etc., etc. Do you think, what are your thoughts on, I guess I need to try and formulate this very carefully. The phenomenon of cognition, the higher faculties, which to a certain extent have reached stages of complexity that would be a burden to the hunter-gatherer. So certainly we have disadapted, I would say, as from the state in which, even from the apes that we are, in which we would have been highly adapted to our environments by having thoughts that can overcrowd, that can think things that are not immediately useful, that can be creative in ways that can disrupt our environment. So I was just sorry, my son was leaving at the same time, and I literally just had a moment of mental state of noise because he's jumping onto a taxi, and I can't keep the focus while thinking that he's going to be disappearing without me seeing who he's leaving with. No, so I'm going to have to formulate this question very badly. This mind-body connection still presumes a dualism that we have inherited, philosophically speaking, the mind-body dualism. So it's as if we were moving away from something for which we never had scientific proof, to prove that the mind and the body are not separate at all. And I don't mean by this to reduce all of the materially existing, all of what culture is, all of the books that have been written. I mean, everything cannot be reduced to biology, but I would wonder whether what you say to a certain extent invalidates the very hypothesis of a relation between mind and body as if there were two. And now it's knocking at the door. This is terrible. This is a real. Oh, one moment, please.
Yeah.
I was convinced I had this organization bulletproof, but clearly that's not how it worked. Yes, so this very badly formulated with mental and emotional noise in the background, in my mind, reverberating through my body. The question was this. Can you even hear me? Does it work?
No, you're okay.
Oh, yeah, good.
Yeah.
The very hypothesis from which we start the mind-body correlation as a philosophical inheritance, is that something that we can finally question in a radical way?
Well, sure. I think, but even today, we live in that dualism. I mean, people in my profession, for instance, they don't like the fact that the body is so important. They really want to see the brain and what we can do there to make people well. The wellness movement is changing that, thank God, to support the many different contributors to making us well, to make our mental health weller, and make our brains work best. So it's still with us, and one of my tactics of using the peripherally acting beta blockers was to show that, hey, the body is really important. And you would think that medical doctors, psychiatrists would have come to that, but they had not, and they still want to be able to reduce it to something they can control, which is the medication that's going to affect this or that part of the brain to do this or that, and miss the opportunity to see the body and all that we can do with our bodies to have an effect on our thinking. And so, yes, do I think it's still with us? It absolutely is. One of the fights I'm having with not having, it's sort of over, the department at Harvard that I speak for in our continuing medical education has sort of eliminated our program that has been there for 25 years because they want to switch it to a more quote, science-based. So they're eliminating meditation, lectures on meditation and on exercise, on general wellness, on diet, and really to focus on psychopharmacology, on etc. So they're really, and I speak for the psychopharm people. I talk about stimulants every year for our master class in psychopharmacology. We have 900 to 1,000 attendees, psychiatrists. So I'm very, very comfortable with psychopharmacology, but it misses the point of what we can do body-wise to make ourselves weller. One of the big papers that and a series of papers that have come out of Duke University Medical School is looking at exercise versus one of our antidepressants. And they get the same effect if you for people who are mildly to moderately depressed, the same effect. And this had to be done in a bigger study with a placebo group, blah, blah, so forth and so on, because people didn't believe it. Again, when we were talking earlier, my favorite quote from Yogi Berra is, "I wouldn't have seen it if I didn't believe it." And that's a message for scientists. They still are operating, and supposed scientists in my field, they're still operating on the belief that it's all about the brain, and the body is somehow not as involved. When I was training and reading so much, it was the world of psychoanalysis. I was in everybody was in psychoanalysis. So, and the psychoanalytic thinkers, the ones that I paid particularly a lot of attention to, were the women, who were much more body-based than the men in general. Phyllis Greenacre, the one that I mentioned, and Karen Horney, various others that really took into consideration the body, because they had children. Anyway, I could go on and on. So
it's interesting the way that you answered my question, because it makes me think that the dualism of mind and body, to a certain extent, the one I was thinking of, has probably already been dispatched to the kind of past, in the sense that when I say mind, you think brain. So within a kind of materialist paradigm, there is a monopolization, if you like, of perhaps reducing mind to the centralization of the brain, rather than understanding the distributed nature of cognition throughout the body and its the various aspects of the nervous system.
Right. No, I agree that and what my work really, I think, was about, is to show this, that it's not just one area. It's not just the brain. It's the whole being that we need to understand and treat. And that noise affects us, all the time. And it can affect our bodies, it affects our body and our brains and all that.
Ah, man, this is like a demonstration of noise. I can't believe that. I'm so sorry. So I got rid of my wire-free telephone because I could never find it. And now I have this telephone that makes the walls vibrate when it rings. It's like one of these old dial telephones that nobody can use apart from me.
Can I take this opportunity just to, there's a question in the chat that I'll just read. I don't know if you can see it, John, but it says, it's a question from Yvonne Holmes, I caught. I always thought ADHD was a differentiation adaptation for those in our hunter-gatherer communities who were the inventors and explorers. They were the ones incapable of sitting still to do the tasks required. But in a community of low relative noise, they were the ones who were the idea generators. In the 21st century, that adaptation is not as well suited because the world is so noisy and doesn't really give these chronic thinkers or dreamers the same environment to add outlier value. So the question is, what do you think about that? Because it usually gets referred to as a disorder or illness.
No, in our new book, we take that to task and call it a trait, variable attention stimulus trait, VAST, just for wanting another four-letter name for it. But because it's not necessarily a disorder, it's a trait, and people have it to varying degrees. And yes, and we make a big deal about the benefits of the ADHD person from the hunter-gatherer up to the present. Most of our incredible inventions are done by people who have ADHD or seem to have ADHDs. So it's the people who say the emperor has no clothes, or why are we doing it this way? Let's try, because they don't have part of the ahistorical self. They don't remember what they're supposed to be guided by, and so they're able to lead into the future. Best story is the head of JetBlue Airlines. When he was at Southwest, he was flying all over the place. He was a vice president there, and he got fired in it eventually. But he's the reason that we have automatic ticket producers in computers at the airport, because he would get to the airport and have forgotten his ticket all the time. And he said, well, why do I have to remember to bring my ticket? And so they installed the first, in the airport, the machines to print your tickets. So he said, I don't have to, and he's serious ADHD, and 5 of his kids do as well. So, yes, and no one had asked that question, or no one had pushed that button before him, and a variety of other incredible people. And we count Steve Jobs and certainly Bill Gates and Elon Musk and all these incredible innovators as people in the ADHD community. And some acknowledge and some don't.
Sorry, one question I would like to put to you again in a way, because I realized that it had been in my mind already when I read your paper. At the time that I read your paper, I was writing my PhD while raising 3 small children. And it occurred to me that the vulnerability to noise, when you say that the patient is someone who is always open, whose filter for pertinence is inoperative. So I was wondering to what extent this is something that has a gender nuance.
Yeah.
Not only gender nuance, but I think today you could also say more generally that occupations that involve care, that have perhaps historically in patriarchal societies been more put on the shoulders of women, but no longer now. I would say that now whoever is in a position to have to care for others and who has this requirement of being open at all times and give full attention to whoever calls for their attention. What I see is a kind of dichotomy between, on the one hand, the situation in which capitalism requires a form of hyper-focus for which we are not biologically adapted. So the idea that we should always switch off our default mode network, which appears to have an evolutionary benefit. It's there for a reason. It's not that our brain is off. So the requirement of being always on. And on the other hand, the fact that many people not only women, are in conditions where privilege becomes a focus. So the capacity to, you know, I would say almost that under capitalism, to be someone who cares, even in a profession where you have to care as a medical doctor, for instance, you're much more exposed to the mental state of noise, not only because you are always open, but also because you live under capitalism in a society where this requirement for hyperfocus makes noise the problem. I don't know if I've expressed myself very confusedly here. If I did, then don't hesitate to say so, and I'll try and say it in a very short sentence, much more clearly.
No, I sort of get the drift, but yes, and I don't know where capitalism comes in, but yes, we're asked to do things that we're not sort of genetically driven or not genetically evolved to do, and then gender-wise from the very beginning, whether or not it's biologic or societal or, you know, within the lifetime evolution, women have to pay attention to many more factors, especially those that have had children, and so they're more comfortable with multitasking, and I'm not sure that's what you asked, but no. Go ahead.
No, I think it's not true. I think it's I'm sorry that I said it like I just realized that I hadn't switched off my microphone. I'm still flustered from all the interruptions I had earlier. What I was trying to say is that the socioeconomic factors of living in a society where your financial viability requires the privilege of focus. So your financial independence, you're thriving, you're doing well, the more you can focus, the more you have also time to study, for instance, without having to shoulder, you know, immediate financial needs, creates a situation in which functions of care, whether they're performed by a man or a woman or anything in between, put people in a position. I saw, for instance, that BMJ often reports on the high prevalence of mental health illnesses amongst doctors and nurses, especially obviously in situations of crisis like we have with the pandemic at the moment. So this was my thought, was whether to a certain extent we have to understand the mental state of noise, the need to medicate for it, and the need to compensate for it, also as something that has socioeconomic correlates. So that we live in a situation in which, unless you are privileged to have focus, the openness that is normally a healthy function, it becomes a problem, one that can hinder that can be a source of, you know, economic precariousness, which then adds itself to mental health issues.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So the more privileged, the less noise you're going to have. But you know that, and I think that goes with just thinking about it, that you're able to protect yourself, to take the time to focus on studies, to focus on focusing, as opposed to just being driven by the moment, by the many demands of the moment, like raising a family, having the money, doing whatever, so that you can focus on focusing, you know, and therefore be trained that way. Then certainly your children, our children, you know, who are in the right kind of school, the best schools, you know, where they're given great tasks, but at the same time they're not bothered by having to go to work in the afternoon. You know, it's anyway.
It seems to be a good moment to open up to the floor, because I see a first hand up already, Daniel Nemenu, whom I also want to thank because he's been very instrumental and important in setting up the seminar in the first place, and he's a great colleague and thinker who's done a lot of work on cybernetics and information. So I'm really pleased to have his question. And Patrick also has his hand up, but obviously I didn't see who had it up first. And yeah, at this point, I would like invite everybody who wants to join the discussion to put their cameras on, but only their mics on when you're actually speaking. And I'm just going to ask Daniel to ask his question.
Nope, I don't hear him.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, there you go.
Okay, great. Hi. Do you see a contradiction between the pathologization of the ADHD and the medicalization or pharmacologization of the person with ADHD? And as you said, after Patrick's question, the potential genius or the potential extended cognitive capacities of people with ADHD. Which is to say, do you see a contradiction between your presentation and your response to Patrick's question?
No, I mean, well, no, I mean, I focused on, sorry, I focused on the problems with the ADHD, not on the benefits. And that's what I was trying to say. I mean, you have to know that most of our work, well, 4 books are written, and we certainly talk about the problems, but also the benefits. And medication. I mean, the problem is ADHD has become a moral diagnosis. It's like it's not as medical as it should be, and use of medicines become a moral issue, just like the anti-vaxxers is a moral thing. You know, it's not based on anything but belief. So it gets bandied about by everyone or by many people, and is seen as something that is negative, when it actually is. We say that when you get the diagnosis, that's something positive, because life can be changed. It doesn't necessarily have to be medicine. Many people do it fine by doing the right lifestyle changes, by getting involved in exercise, sport, playing soccer, basketball, whatever, that help keep their focus on. So it's not necessarily all about medicine all the time.
Certainly, I mean, I don't mean to suggest that, if you don't mind me following up, I don't mean to suggest that many people with ADHD don't struggle with the kinds of noise that you refer to. What I'm suggesting is that perhaps the problem with ADHD isn't the people with ADHD, it's with the society, which doesn't account for, which doesn't afford the possible lives of people with ADHD. You did mention at the end of your end of your talk, social conditions such as noise and, from roads. But for people with ADHD, for example, boredom, as I'm sure you are acutely aware, boredom becomes a trigger for for an incapacity to think clearly. We live in an economy which furnishes, massive amounts of boring jobs, schooling, which feels redundant for huge swathes of the student population. At least from a European perspective, we're very aware that the American system, highly medicates American students with Ritalin and other drugs to counteract their ADHD. But perhaps the problem is the curriculum itself. It's not that people have ADHD. Perhaps it's jobs which don't have meaning, and perhaps it's it's employers throwing too many things at their employees and not giving them sufficient time to get in the zone. Because one of the features of ADHD, as I'm sure you're also aware, is the capacity for a hyper focus when they finally get into the zone. So perhaps, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, there is a moralism, and I think that there should be, to an extent, because being disabled by a society should be something we take a moral stance on. It is a bad, but the focus cannot surely just be on helping the person with ADHD or the ADHD person to simply focus on themselves and their own exercise. It surely must be to as a critique of society itself. Wouldn't you agree? Or...
Yeah, certainly. Yes, society puts so much negativity on anybody who's different, and that certainly with the ADD people, but you know, I mean, they're 25%. I'm sure, sorry, 15% of the people in the U.S. Meet the criteria for pretty significant ADHD. So it's a big percentage of people, and partly because we're all immigrants here, and you know, we've had parents that moved or grandparents that came over and left the comfort of where they were. So they brought the explorer and the inquisitive genes with them. But also with that, they brought the not being able to sit still in what, you know, our classrooms. I mean, yes, the big problem is that our kids aren't moving enough. This is the biggest problem that I would say in terms of putting the fix on the noise, the internal noise of people and our children, and also in improving focus and test scores and all that.
Yeah, thank you, Dan.
I think we might
Did you
have
did
to
you
agree
want
to
to follow up?
disagree. Yeah.
Okay, now I'm not hearing
Well,
anybody.
sorry, no, I thought I'm actually in a public space. I'm in the library, so I didn't hear what you said. I thought you said to Patrick to follow up, and that's absolutely fine by me if that's what you wanted to say.
Okay, then Patrick, thank you very much. If you want to ask your
Yeah.
question.
Thank you. First of all, thanks very much for a really fascinating paper from lots of different angles. I'm in a Department of French Literature, and I'm so quite a different perspective from that of neuroscience. But I'm interested in daydreams and in reverie, and I was very interested that fascinated that you connected the default network or having the capacity for daydreaming when in the I think it's true to say that in the kind of cultural or literary tradition, daydreaming or reverie would seem to be associated with a more quieter mode. So it seems like a quite radical shift of perspective there. So that was my first point, which hasn't got to a question yet, but then as you went on and the other questions, I thought I had a quite good grasp of the opposition between the task network and the default network. The task network being focused on the task and the default network being the kind of background, lots of different things. But then as you were talking, I lost the purchase on that opposition. It looked like that, particularly with the idea of the focus on focus, seemed to be closer to something like reverie, and with the idea of meditation being less, well, I guess it is a task. It's the task of thinking of nothing. Well, I don't know enough about it to be able to say that. But is it a very strict opposition? Let's say that's the question between the task network and the default network. Are they? I thought you were saying at the beginning that you couldn't see two different places. They were kind of connected to on the.
Right. No, I think for simplicity's sake, they are oppositional, but they actually are joined at the hip, much like our body and our brains and our minds. They're all one. So, but when you do mind wandering is fine if that's your direction, if that's your purpose, and you know, to be in that reverie kind of state. However, when you're what we saw with our ADHD kids and adults is that they didn't want to be there, and they weren't always thinking pleasant thoughts. In fact, a lot of them get into ruminations which is the mind taking off on how bad they are. And as Danielle's point, that society has sort of condemned them and made them feel less than and culpable for being failures. And they go on and on and on, and then this rumination takes over, and they develop depression and anxiety and all the rest that leads to ill health, for sure, ill mental health. So yeah, I mean, in the quiet, in the French space of just sort of in south of France, lying back and just dreaming about the world, love it, and that's where we all want to be. But the kind of issue with our ADD people and what we talk about is they're always in a battle to stay attentive to whatever the task is, and they can't do it. And this is the problem. So there's not like they sit back and are comfortable. When you put people into a scanner, it's usually very hard for them to be comfortable unless they're meditators, and then they can get real comfortable.
It's interesting because I have the impression that the concerns, my concern initially with the kind of socioeconomic context in which noise becomes a problem, or it kind of joins up with Patrick's question of daydreaming as something that is very important in creative culture, but that's out of place and a source of sufferance when you're expected to perform in the school context, for instance. And Daniel's question about this dichotomy between the genius and the person who suffers, and the fact that we should think about a critique of society as well. And notably of the kind of what anthropologist, I think it's David Graeber, was it David? Because I also know another Graeber. What Graeber called the bullshit job economy. I wonder, when you say that the people who suffer because they cannot switch between the default mode network and focus, and when they are in the default mode network, which is this kind of intrusive, and they have ruminations, if you put that back into the context of society and think that ADHD in all likelihood has higher prevalence when there is economic precarity, when there is perhaps unstable homes or potentially violent environments, I'm wondering from what you're saying whether the default mode network is intrusive because it needs more space to metabolize traumatic environments. Could that be one aspect of it?
Yeah, when you get into trauma,
maybe trauma is too big a word, but stress.
But it's very involved with the default mode. So and then in various aspects, and so do we need more space? I think we do need more space, and that's the socioeconomic side. Is that if you have the means, you can have more space. But anyway. Now we're not
muted. You're muted.
The perils of digital.
Okay, now.
Okay.
It was listening to me. I kept clicking the mic, but it didn't work. Okay, we have also a few questions in the chat, and a few people who've raised their hands, and I have judiciously avoided keeping track of who asked the question first and who raised their hands. So I'll start perhaps with a question that I saw earlier, and I saw Sonia has her hand up, and I'll start with that question, then come back to Sonia if that's okay. So one question from Devon Holmes at Devon Holmes Accourt, I think. Hope I pronounced that correctly. A question. I always thought ADHD was a differentiation adaptation. For those in our hunter-gatherer communities.
Sorry to interrupt you, Cecile, but it was already asked by Patrick
That's
earlier.
that's when I
and
was
there's a new question by the same person.
Okay.
But there is a new question by the same person. So
okay. So should I go maybe one after the other? There was a question by Annette Manning. Has that been asked when I was
that was not asked, no.
So can you speak to the inherited aspect? I come from a family with many ADHD members.
Yeah, absolutely. Inherited. Yes, yes, yes. That's how we know. I mean, the genetics of inheritance are, fairly clear, so that you see it is sprinkled in the family throughout, and some with the hyperactivity, some without, some with just the daydreamer aspects of ADHD, but you see this all the time. And there probably is a bit of a sort of mating here going on as well. That people more with the ADHD gene, the hunter qualities, are going to be interested in other hunters because they're not boring. They're not people that are just driven by order. So yeah, we see this all the time. So yes, it's very much a familiar kind of inheritance.
Annette also added that exercise and meditation have been very important to her family. So I think that kind of underlines the points that you were making. So I've got the second question by Devon, who says, if I may add something from my own experience on the medication controversy. For me, medication does not interfere or dampen creative thoughts. The medication allows me to see priority and relevance contours. Which ideas are the good ones, where otherwise it would just be an endless sea of rumination and equally weighted thoughts and revelations. You get stuck there without the medication. It gives me the clarity to choose which ideas to communicate, and for some reason gives me motivation to do so.
Yeah, no, but that's exactly what it can be. I mean, it can really help with the creative mode and allowing you to latch onto something and not be dissuaded by competing thoughts and images, much as I try to describe. Some people have that, and so it can be very helpful. And certainly can keep people from falling into the big debate was whether you should medicate or not, and that might change the brain or change their lives in one way or the other. Most of the time, it changes the brain very well, and if you don't medicate some people, some kids especially, you have a prediction that they're more than likely going to have lots of failure and lots of stress and depression and anxiety. And that certainly changes the brain for the future. And so that's why we have to call attention to this as something that it is a myth of, it's going to change the brain. Yes. Thanks. Thankfully, it will allow the person to flower, just as the respondent mentioned. They're able to do more and be more.
On this point precisely, I have another question to kind of put this back into the socioeconomic context, but a very quick one, because I would like to pass on to Sonia afterwards. But because it relates exactly to what you just said now, it seems to me that a lot of students, and particularly when they're in highly competitive environments, take stimulant drugs that are normally used for ADHD to perform better in exams. And the question I wanted to ask you is if this paradoxical effect that someone who has ADHD, therefore I presume attention deficit with hyperactivity, is actually calmed down, what is the effect on someone who doesn't have ADHD and who maybe takes it as an enhancement drug? And I mean, from anecdotally, from speaking to students, I heard people who could then never not be anxious anymore. I'm so sorry. Hello? Yeah, I'm sorry. In my
Anyway, I'll answer her question. Yes, it does calm people down, including those that don't have ADHD or are not diagnosed as such. Again, it's a trait that we all have, and it's so that by being more focused, you're going to be calmer. That's the whole point of your question, Cecilia. You're going to be calmer most of the time. Now, sometimes it can be very exciting, and and if you take too much of it, you're going to be too energetic and too talkful and too talkative. But most of the time, people use it to finish that paper, to get at that theorem, whatever it is. That they take it as a supplement. And they look. I say, look. Do you want? People use it as a supplement, but this is in lieu of monster drinks, of 6 cappuccinos, or coffee is an alternative stimulant, and people use it all the time to sharpen their focus and do better on whatever they're doing. So you have to put things in perspective, and believe me, so many of the people that we saw, one guy had his espresso maker by his bedside to wake up with in the morning. I mean, and this before he got on medicine, but and he would have 6 or 7 cups in the morning and Pepsi all day, and have a hard time sleeping, so he'd drink to go to sleep. These are real life kinds of issues.
Yeah, thank you, John. Sonia, do you had a question as well?
Thank you. I'm going to try to reformulate it in sort of in the context of the previous. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Because
yeah. Fine.
In the context of the previous questions and comments. So one of the things I was wondering about is, for example, well, just to give an example of my daily life, my partner is diagnosed ADHD, but he started medicating and he quit because for him it didn't work, actually. It just made him numb and he didn't feel that he could, just be his true self, whatever that is that, we used to define ourselves sometimes. It just didn't feel that it was what worked for him. So, there are cases in which things are helpful and in cases in which they aren't. And there are cases, of course, in which it's very clear that someone, self-reports suffering from rumination or depressive thoughts, and actually medication helps them in a way that we cannot say is objective, because let's say the patient and the doctors around this patient agree, but more or less, if the patient self-reports as suffering, then we can understand that medication is helping. But there are certain cases in which, we enter more of the gray zone, where it's not necessarily suffering, but maybe indeed, so what has been mentioned before about people being more creative, perhaps, if they are people with ADHD, etc. And so a word, like a concept that we employ, semantically, democratically amongst us all, as a concept such as comfort, becomes something that the patient internalizes as like, this is what people expect me to be as comfortable, let's say, or this is what comfort is supposed to be. So I am actually not comfortable, whereas perhaps they are comfortable. But this interplay between that, that membrane between all of us, which is language, is something that creates that strange situation in which there is a lot of ambiguity, there is a lot of and so my question, so to tie it all back together, would be, how do you as a scientist navigate that strange space where we have to make assumptions in order to proceed with, like literally metaphysical, transcendental assumptions to proceed forward into the future? We have to say, this is what I believe, you know, comfort should be for someone. A person should feel well in these and these ways. And at the same time, you cannot entirely be sure about what that is ever. So,
Right.
I'm sorry for the long, convoluted question.
You know, there are very a number of ambiguity points that are just in your question. But yeah, no, what I think you know, is that I'm all about optimizing our cognitive processes and emotional and having the best kind of emotional life that you can have. So whatever that takes is where I go. I'm not sure how this answers your question or not, but it's
So if I may quickly just add so indeed, the best emotional life, as you define it, has a very specific set of parameters. And my question would be, yeah, how, yeah.
Right. Well, what that is a less noisy state, you know, to take back to our talk today, you know, and that doesn't necessarily mean the absence of pain or the absence of worry, but if you're less noisy, that you have a better time in apprehending what it is that you're dealing with, and so that's my overarching goal, and is making people well enough or weller, and as we ended at, you know, I'm less concerned with the use of medication and than I am with getting the general public very much well by using all the wellness levers that we know of: exercise, diet, sleep, meditation, and the big one is connection. We call it vitamin C in our books and in our lives, that the connection is so important. It is so powerful, a sign of health. And we have studies to show that the more connected you are, the longer you live and the less sick you'll get.
That might be a good point to introduce the next question by Mary Robinson, who asks, what are your thoughts about the noise from technology addictions such as cell phones?
Yes, you can't get a ubiquitous question and ubiquitous occurrence, you know, our cell phone addiction or computer addiction. My thoughts are, it really has an impact on us, you know, and we know that it does, and we know that it's so addicting to have it there already all the time, you know, and people were probably looking at their cell phone during the lecture and during this proceeding just to see if something important occurred or not. Years ago, when we were just getting into the cell phone, and we were beginning to check on things, and it was really novel, I said, well, you know, this when you get a new message, I said, that's a dopamine squirt. It's a little bit of dopamine that gets hit to your motivation and pleasure area in your brain and your attention, because, oh my God, I'm relevant, somebody cares, or somebody hates me. Doesn't matter what the valence is, that you're still relevant. You know, now you're so relevant these days with so much spam coming in, but you know, but it is addicting, and it's addicting for all of us, and our kids coming up. My 5-year-old grandson, you know, his favorite thing is iPad, you know, and we got our granddaughter, who's now 8, to crawl forward because she was doing the backward crawl by using a variety of targets that she could crawl towards. Nothing worked like the cell phone. She already saw this as the most favorite thing. She had no idea what it was, but she knew that mommy and daddy used it all the time. So that's what caused her to crawl forward. We cheated. So I think that's just emblematic of where we're at in the world today and where the problem is. And there's so much noise. There's so much streaming at us all the time. And thankfully, those of us that have the means, we go to the south of France. So we go to Hawaii for us, you know, to get away from the noise and to have the space to
John,
contemplate.
I have a little follow-up question about the networks, because the question of connectivity is, you said, is absolutely central to our well-being, and I think that plugs immediately into the wider framework also of a social and economic connectivity, whether we are, you know, on the margins of an economy, whether we are whether we are able to thrive in it, whether we have the opportunity to thrive in it. But when young people, everyone, but especially young people, increasingly rely on technologies like mobile phones to stay connected, and it's almost immediately seen to be a bad thing. But I notice it is also a way of socializing that replaces a freedom that children no longer have, which is just to, you know, leave the house and go and meet their friends. Children, young people are under so much pressure for other reasons, either because their environment is not safe or because they have to be at school from morning to evening. So this need to be connected all the time with others, when parents obviously worry about their children being on the phone all the time, but it seems to be also a new social function that is critical for people. Maybe we're not handling it very well yet, but it seems to me not entirely a bad thing.
Oh, I'm not suggesting that it is. It's just the overuse of it and the overdependence on it. And just as we all find this digital gathering less wonderful, even though we're from all parts of the world, than it would be if we were in the same space. There'd be more human connection, a real connection, bodily, whatever that is. I mean, you know, I see patients a lot on Zoom now, of course, and it's not nearly as good as seeing them up close, and them seeing me up close, and you know, noticing nuances and stuff. I mean, in some ways, it's for my ADD patients, it's pretty good because they get the full 45 minutes because that's my hour. Because if they're, you know, in real life, they would be late, or they would, you know, have to, you know, do something else, or they'd get this, you know, but this, they get the full time, and it's really remarkable. And so there's a lot that happens during that time. So it's I find it's a plus minus. Certainly, in all the lecturing I do, I really miss being in the same room with everybody. I mean, just miss it enormously. Because one, I could be pacing, which I usually do, right? And it's hard to pace on Zoom. But and sort of going in and out of the audience, and just not any kind of great way, but just enough to have them and me feel connected to them.
Thank you, John. Are there other questions from the audience? Is there someone who would like to chip in? And please do help me if I'm kind of not seeing a hand raised or
there was a
question
hand
posted
raised
somewhere.
earlier, but I think it disappeared. I have a small follow-up question, if you don't mind, if that's okay. So before, when Cecile asked the first question about the sort of, the social pressure created by the context of capitalism, then you mentioned that for you it wasn't clear how capitalism related to that question of social pressure. But then, so in relation to the question about how, you know, the technology that we use, which can be great for a lot of different types of communication, cell phones and computers, etc., that it's designed because it's driven to produce, to make a profit, and so indeed, cell phones are literally little sort of slot machines where we get small hits of dopamine when we use them. Like there is the immediate relation, right, between the social pressure created by the context of capitalism. So I was wondering what your comment would be on that, on the problem of capitalism, and maybe being able to escape, of course, is a possibility, but only if we are privileged enough to do so, and otherwise we remain within the
certainly, but and even in the no matter what society, it's going to be a capitalistic kind of thing. It's going to, Verizon or AT&T or somebody's going to, be happy that you're on the cell phone or on the network. Although it's getting so inexpensive to do these things, but it still takes it still goes into that. But I think that's what your question is, right? But it's not something that I've thought much about. So I don't. I'd have to think about it a while.
Thank you. Oh, there's a question in the chat.
Okay. Oh, this is from Kent, from Lawrence Kent. Sorry. Coming from a film studies background, would you say that there are any films that depict ADD convincingly? Film itself as a medium and as an institution has an interesting history in thinking around the distractions of modernity. And today, with technological addiction to screens, as you've said. But can film meaningfully depict ADD in content and perhaps also in form? As far as I know, ADD is rarely mentioned explicitly in film, ? But does reading characters from the history of film as presenting characteristics of ADD help us understand how society has engaged with attention deficit disorders? And in parentheses, a supposedly Maria von Trapp from The Sound of Music is a great example of a character with ADD, and that makes her well suited to engaging with children and, of course, music teaching.
Sure. There are many. None come to mind. We were doing a film, Dr. Hallowell and I, and a bunch of Hollywood people were doing a film to expound. It wasn't it was more of an exposition on what ADHD is and how people's lives were affected. There are a number of them that have been out over the years, but none of them are sort of made it into my memory as to who they are and what they are. There was one out of Canada that looked, and it was more of a documentary than it was an artistic portrayal. But when I see a film, I think of a lot of the people, a lot of the characters have ADHD qualities, and certainly the actors and actresses. Oh my God, when you're talking about ADHD in a profession, it is rampant there, rampant. And and it's part of what they're driven to have a project. They can hyper focus on it, but then they get incredibly distracted. So, and thankfully, you know, some of the super athletes are beginning to talk about their own ADHD, you know, and being an athlete, being someone who's training every day, you know, a good part of the day, they're treating their ADD. You know, one of my index patient was a marathoner and a professor at MIT and Harvard, a very famous fellow who was a marathoner all his life, and he hurt his knee running after many years and had to stop for a while. And came to see me because he had ADHD symptoms. Never had them before. And treated him with medicine, and that helped. He got back his, you know, rehabbing his knee, got back to running, and eventually his need for medicine disappeared. So one can certainly get by with using the correct lifestyle without having to use medication. And I'm not sure that answers the question, but that's what I got. And I was hoping that we weren't going to get talking just about ADHD, but we.
Yeah, that seems to be something that resonates with a lot of people, and
Yes.
perhaps that speaks to what we mentioned in our brief conversation before everybody else joined, which was my worry whether what you described in your paper, the concept of noise, is the catastrophic reaction. Now that you were talking about athletes, I was wondering whether this aspect of hyper focus in people who have ADD or ADHD, depending on whether they're hyperactive or not, whether this aspect of hyper focus is also a form of catastrophic reaction. It's a way of shutting out maybe thoughts. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Experiences in your life that are very disturbing, and workaholism could be a form of hyper focus for people who want to, you know, block out the noise of emotions reverberating, things not going right. And perhaps we can plug this back into this conversation about the tremendous social transformations that we're seeing at the moment. I mean, they're not entirely new. There are, to a certain extent, history repeating itself, but these we were talking briefly about conspiracy theories, the kind of, I suppose, xenophobia, nationalism, social phenomena, collective social phenomena that would appear to have that kind of quality of a catastrophic reaction to uncertainty. I mean, to the economic crisis, ecological crisis, public health crisis.
Yeah, no, I mean it's true. I mean the people who get hyper focused in a way sometimes are driven to it because it really does block out the noise. It blocks out everything else, so that they dive into it, you know, as a way to forget about their whatever they're trying to forget, or trying to diminish in their consciousness. So yeah, I mean, and the hyper focus is really something interesting, you know, that it's when the front part of the DMN gets activated on what's ahead, and they go and they spend their time just really spending all their energy, if you will, on that as a way of you know, and everything else gets quiet for them. They get really focused, and they stay with it, and they stay with it a long time, and it's why we have the computers. You know, why I mean, anyway, we go into that, but I mean, you know, my office was between Harvard and MIT during the times that we wrote about ADD, and many of my patients were professors and students from both areas. MIT had more than 50% of their kids probably had ADHD, and that's among the most selected people in the world for brilliance, and yet a lot of them also were insatiable and with their searching for this, searching for that, and I mean that it's one of the reasons why I think we have the computer. You know, if we didn't have autistic people, Asperger people, ADHD people, OCD people, we wouldn't have the computer. But anyway, I'm getting off on some tangent, so bring me back.
I mean, one of the things that I think seems to be coming back is this question of openness as something that is on the one hand what is needed to be selected to somewhere like Harvard. You need to, as a function of intelligence, perhaps this allows us also to come back to the purpose of this seminar, which was to look at the different ways in which we can think about intelligence, not only as information processing, but also in relation to noise. What is it about intelligence that uses noise creatively? What is it that we can learn about intelligence when it fails to function well, and it is then perceived as something to do with noise?
Right. Well, you know, for a while there, when we wrote the paper and we were sort of fully immersed in thinking about noise, one of the things that was just taking off was using noise to promote new thoughts, you know, new creative thinking. And that's what we see with the default mode too. You know, instead of just noise, sometimes it pops up, you know, a novel way to use something or a new idea, and it can come from there's I'm sure some people later in your seminar will talk about how noise can prompt a new activity or new space, a new finding, because it can. So because that gives the pressure to do something different.
Would you say that there is, in the default mode network, an aspect of randomness that can be mobilized creatively?
Oh, yeah, it's like, well, we said in our first book that creativity is impulsivity gone right. You know, is just an impulsive feeling or action that's now, you know, helpful and different. That's seen as creative, but it's really impulsive thinking. You know, and then channeling it and focusing on it, hyper focusing on it, and then you get a new idea. Then you get the Tesla.
And could I ask you, is the default mode network, when you are in different sleep cycles, how does that affect the default mode network? Because we were talking about daydreaming, but is it? I presume it's active also when we are sleeping, and I imagine it changes in the different sleep cycles, and it's got something to do with the way that dreams also metabolize to a certain extent our experience during the day.
Sure.
Or help to consolidate. I don't know what dreams are good for.
Yeah, I'm not conversant with that, so I don't want to even wade into it. But I do know that being in deep sleep, being in deep sleep, really cleanses our brain and cleanses those connections. So But other than that, I have nothing to say about the default mode in sleep.
In that case, perhaps we've got two questions here, one from Jim Shrub and one from Elaine. Elaine, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. I am a retired physician, and I am curious as to whether or not the ability or the effectiveness of brainwashing is more appealing to people who have more brain noise.
You mean you mean to commit
To be influenced by brainwashing. You
Yeah.
made some comments at the end of your presentation about our current political situation with so much what appears to be irrationality in approach to information. I feel a lot of that effect is the effect of brainwashing, the constant repetition of misinformation. But I would also suspect that there's a good portion of individuals who present with this level of what we look at as irrationality, who may have underlying ADD, ADHD, other types of situations that perhaps, you know, have more brain noise associated with them. And it appears that it is so difficult to approach these individuals in any kind of sensible matter. They're just simply resistant to facts. So I would like to get your comments on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I don't know that it's ADD, ADHD, or any kind of brain pathology to start with, but I think so much of it is because of a large group of those people are always are feeling left out, you know, and left out of society, left out of the capitalistic society, you know, a lot, and so they, you know, are milling around, and there's this idea, anti-vaxxers or Brexits or something to, you know, champion that it's Trump. You know, we have a banner now. We have something that we can focus on, and so their dis-ease, literally, their dis-ease promotes them to try to find this sexy answer. Okay, this is this. It's why they become so rabid. It's crazy. You know, here every Sunday afternoon where we're at in Michigan, there's a Trump parade. I mean, what? You know, I mean, come on. What in God's name? I mean, it's, and this used to be, this is where all the cars were built back in the day. And those people are now not working, they're disaffected, and they're marching for this guy who has no interest in them other than, you know, to drum them up. But yet they are rabid. Just like you say, there's no amount of logical presentation to them to get them to change their mind. It's not going to happen. And so we begin by having these parallel lives and differences, and I don't know where it's going to end. You know, everybody's afraid of where it's going in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine, for your question. Jim, do you want to come in with a question?
Yes. Can you hear me well? I'm just curious. This is probably going to be a bit naive, but I was wondering what sports you test your patients on, whether like individual or collective sports, and well, did that happen with a coach or a physiotherapist, and could you actually measure the impact of like this human interaction compared to like exercise itself in your various studies on?
Well, there's a lot of papers that are out there written about the different sports that are useful, but what we do know is that the more complicated sports, the sport that really demands you to think and change and use your attention while you're active, are the ones that are most productive for, or how should I say, the most healing, or to help repair for the moment the problems in the brain, because the brain gets better as we use most of it, as we use more of it. So the more you do, the more switches and changes you do, the better. So, for instance, they did studies on a group of kids in Germany who did cognitive tests, 10 minutes of running on a treadmill, repeat the cognitive tests. Their test scores improved. The next week they came in, different cognitive tests, 10 minutes of exercise, but this time with balance and coordination challenges. Did the test after that, their test scores improved even above what it did with just the aerobic exercise, the straight ahead running. So, which points up that something like basketball, something like soccer, something like anything that it involves more than just getting your heart rate up, which is the best measure for brain activity. That's what we talk about so often, is that the higher your heart rate means the more your heart has to work to pump to your brain, because that takes about 70% of our blood flow. And this is the magic of getting our brain into what we call the neuroplastic state, the state of growth of our brain cells. And this is why why so many of our people that are really superior in a lot of things they do spend a good concentrated part of their day exercising. And when you exercise, like running outside is so much better than running on a treadmill for the same amount of time, because you have to adapt. You have to adapt to the change in the plane of where you're running, and you don't want to trip over a route, and as opposed to running on a treadmill where you just space out and listen to your podcast or whatever people do these days. So, and that's why, by the way, the best exercise is probably dance. Probably dance, because you're moving in an aerobic way. You're getting your heart rate up. You're really exercising more of your muscles. And you have to do it in a very strict manner if you're a really good dancer. You'd have to follow the guidance of what you've learned. And you're following the music. I know we're going to have a music talk later, which would be great. Following the music, and throw in another person, and it's really complicated for your brain. Your brain has to really be on fire, whether it's one person or a whole group or whatever it is, but and moving in space, not just changing, your, 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 whatever, your movement, posture or whatever. You just have to, and so this is a professor from the University of British Columbia, has really written about this in a way, and she says the dance is the best way to treat ADHD, the best way to get our brains working optimally. So,
Do you remember her name by any chance? I'd like to read up.
oh, remember Adele. I'll send it to you.
Yes, thank you. I'll post it later for the others.
Yeah.
This is a wonderful note to end on, because you wouldn't believe it that what I'm going to do next is to pick up the son who interrupted me earlier, who left with the taxi, to do breakdancing.
Oh, good for you. Good for you.
Good for him. There's balance, there's other people, there's music, there's it's not really for me. It's too acrobatic and athletic for me, but it's certainly something extraordinary to watch, especially if you go to a cipher where you see the creativity of people coming together. I often think of it as a paradigm of a utopia of education for me. The fact that you have people who not only strive for excellence, reach levels of athleticism and skill without any grades, without any selection or deselection, or I mean, it's competitive in a way that makes the connection more important than the deselection. It's a really extraordinary culture. So perhaps that's I don't know, unless there's more questions, and I haven't seen someone who has their hands raised. Is there somebody else who wanted to ask a question? Elaine, I don't know if you still have your hand up or if it's a new question.
No, I don't have another question, but I do appreciate the last comments about dance, because when my children went to elementary school many years ago, the 4th grade PE involved tremendous amount of dance. And I think that was extremely beneficial to them. They did all kinds of dancing. And I think it should be part of the curriculum every day for children. Exercise for children is crucial, whether they have any underlying conditions or not. I'm a former pediatrician, and that was always part of my wellness routine. Get the kids out and let them play. Thank you. It was an excellent presentation. Very, very good.
Well, I have to resonate, amplify. Thank you, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for this very precious time that you've made available to discuss with us and to get into the different aspects of noise. And John, I can't tell you, it's just such an extraordinary joy to meet you and to have had the possibility of exchanging on this with you after having had this dialogue and all in my head, you know, with this one article that you'd written before I discovered all your other works. So this was really, really tremendous, a tremendous honor and pleasure. I thank you very, very much, John, for accepting this invitation, and everybody else. Thanks for joining in. Thanks for making the discussion lively. And perhaps what I should say before we leave each other is that we're going to meet in a month's time on the 11th of November, and Luca Possati is going to talk about the algorithmic unconscious, and his respondent is Dr. Feng Zhu. So sorry, I said the title of Dr. Feng Zhu, but Luca Possati is also doctors, not medical doctors, but still. So this is the 11th of November, and then we have on the 9th of December Professor Catherine Malabou, who is going to talk about Oliver Sacks, musicophilia and how to stop the brain's noise. And her respondent will be Dr. Benjamin Dalton. So and the program continues, but you can all look it up on the links that I've sent everyone, and I really hope that you stay with us, that you come back, and that in the end these different perspectives flow together to kind of animate a field of debate, and hopefully at the end of it we'll come out with hopefully an original perspective on thinking about intelligence and its kind of, you know, organic and technological dimensions. So again, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for having me again. And by the way, through the noise popped Adele Diamond's name. That's who the professor is in UBC. She's a very famous person, neuroscientist who spent her life worrying about the frontal cortex and children especially. So, and she's really into play and dance. So there you go. Okay, so thank you, and I'll see you in November.